The US is preparing to coordinate a massive land attack determined to smash the Houthis in Yemen. And the worst thing for the Houthis is that they'll never see it coming, as the US negotiates to amass a fighting force of 50,000 who'll storm the militant group's strongholds to eliminate them from Yemen forever. This comes as the US has engaged in daily airstrikes designed to decapitate the Houthi leadership. Now, the second phase of the Houthi elimination strategy is getting underway, and with the head cut off, the US is gearing up to support its allies in the Middle East in whatever ways they need to retake Yemen. The news comes from an April 16 Bloomberg report, which says that the US is currently speaking to several of its Gulf Arab allies, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates or UAE, along with several Yemeni forces. The goal of those talks is simple: amass a land force to take out the Houthis. People involved in the discussion say that pushing the Houthis away from the Red Sea coast would decimate the militant group's power base, forcing it to withdraw to the north of Yemen. There, it would be even more vulnerable to US airstrikes and a ground offensive. Those talks are progressing faster than you might expect. US Central Command or CENTCOM head Michael Kurilla has spent much of April speaking to the people who could arrange this type of land offensive in the Saudi capital city of Riyadh. The Pentagon has been tight-lipped about what those talks involved. All generals will say is that they cover ongoing efforts against the Iran-backed Houthis, according to Bloomberg. But the sheer number and scale of Kurilla's meetings tell us that something very important is brewing behind the scenes. We get an idea of this from CENTCOM's official website. Between April 1st and April 2nd, Kurilla traveled to Israel to speak with Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir and several other key staff of the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, as well as leaders from multiple Israeli national security organizations. Zamir isn't any old staffer. He's the IDF's chief of staff, and he's key to ensuring the US and Israel can broaden their already deep defensive ties. While those discussions may have been about strengthening ties, the talks that came later focused more intently on Yemen. On April 3rd, Kurilla traveled to Qatar and the UAE, meeting with Emirati National Security Advisor Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed Al Nahyan in the latter case. Again, CENTCOM only says that talks focused on deepening security relationships and cooperation. However, the UAE is one of the nations that are threatened by Houthi-controlled Yemen, making it likely that the idea of sending land forces to battle the militant group was raised in this meeting. Kurilla has since met with Lieutenant General Saghir Hamoud Ahmed Aziz, who leads the Yemeni armed forces fighting against the Houthis, along with representatives of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, like the UAE, have also been threatened by the Houthis, with the two nations having previously combined forces in a failed attempt to push the Houthis out of Yemen in the past. Kurilla commented on the meetings on April 8. "These engagements with our partners and service members are invaluable," Kurilla said. "They further enhance the trusted relationships we've built with our partners in the region over decades. Working with our partners moves us further toward enhancing deterrence through building interoperable capabilities throughout the region." A boilerplate statement perhaps, but pay attention to what Kurilla said toward the end. Building interoperable capabilities. Those three words revealed the reality of what these talks were all about. The US is working with its allies in the Gulf region to arrange a ground force to take out the Houthis. The question now is simple: why? The main reason the US wants to get rid of the Houthis is already known. The militant group started a campaign of strikes, piracy, and kidnapping in the Red Sea after Israel declared war on Hamas in Gaza. This solidarity campaign started when the Houthis hijacked a commercial ship in the Red Sea on November 19, 2023. Since that hijacking, the group has launched dozens of missile and drone attacks at commercial ships it claims to have ties with Israel, sinking 2 vessels, taking control of 3, and killing 4 crew members in the process. These attacks have also had a massive effect on global commerce. Around 15% of the world's seaborne trade passes through the Red Sea every year. With its attacks, the Houthis have pushed commercial shipping companies into avoiding sailing through the Suez Canal into the Red Sea. Instead, they take a much longer route around the south of the African continent, adding around 3,500 nautical miles and up to 12 days of sailing time to their ships' journeys. Of course, that has a marked effect on global supply chains, along with cutting the revenue Egypt generates from the Suez Canal by around $800 million per month. In short, the Houthi Red Sea attacks affect a lot of countries' commercial interests. Those strikes stopped during the temporary truce between Israel and Hamas, and they restarted when that truce fell apart, which pushed the US into action. Since March 15, the US has conducted daily bombing raids and airstrikes on Houthi positions in Yemen, which Bloomberg says have killed more than 120 people so far. Bloomberg also says an unnamed US defense official told the outlet that the daily strikes have already taken out several of the Houthis' leaders. They've also destroyed key air defense systems, ammunition storage sites, weapons manufacturing facilities, and Houthi command and control stations. However, there's one thing the US strikes have failed to achieve after a month: stopping Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. The US goal of decapitating the Houthis appears to have turned into a constant hacking away at a neck that's proving stronger than anticipated, rather than a swift and clean strike. So, to end the Houthis once and for all, the US has to consider a ground campaign to mop up the remnants of the group while it continues its airstrikes. That's why it's talking to partners about putting boots on the ground in Yemen. However, there's another reason why a ground assault is being spoken about right now: the increasingly strong ties developing between the Houthis and another terrorist group called Al-Shabaab. Bloomberg points out that international concern is growing about this budding relationship, which is creating the potential for the Houthis to spread their influence into several key locations. Al-Shabaab is active in the Gulf of Aden and several locations in the Horn of Africa, including Somalia. The group also has ties to Al-Qaeda, with the Houthis supposedly collaborating with Al-Shabaab on weapons smuggling and military training. Al-Shabaab's presence in the Horn of Africa is also a clear concern. It's around that horn that the container ships currently avoiding the Red Sea sail. If the Houthis can equip Al-Shabaab with weapons, it could extend its Red Sea attacks to this alternative route. That would have a devastating effect on global trade, especially trade between Asia and Europe. Al-Shabaab, which roughly translates to the youth, is a powerful enough group in its own right. Based in Somalia, the group once held significant influence in the Somalian capital of Mogadishu, though an African Union campaign supported by the US managed to push it back out of Somalia's major population centers. Still, Al-Shabaab is resilient enough to not only survive, but present the biggest internal security challenge Somalia faces. We can see them as a mirror image of the Houthis in that respect, as the Houthis represent the same level of threat in Yemen, only to a larger scale. The group has other similarities to the Houthis. The Council on Foreign Relations says that Al-Shabaab funds itself through a combination of working alongside other terrorist groups, local extortion and piracy, all tactics the Houthis use to build their funds. Al-Shabaab also maintains checkpoints through which it charges tolls on exported goods, much like the Houthis and their control of major ports leading into Yemen. The Carnegie Endowment says that the Houthis see their growing alliance with Al-Shabaab as a way to extend their influence into Africa. This is despite the ideological differences that exist between the groups. Such differences are being set aside in favor of the far more pragmatic goal of maintaining influence in key territories. It also shouldn't escape notice that Iran is also linked to Al-Shabaab. While the Somalian group isn't quite one of Iran's proxies in the same way that the Houthis are, that growing link creates even more concern for the United States. It's against this backdrop that the ground strike is being prepared. It's happening because the US understands the danger that combined Houthi and Al-Shabaab forces represent. If that link didn't exist, the US would have been happy to continue the airstrikes it's using to bomb the Houthis into oblivion. But because the link is there, the US is looking for ways to accelerate the destruction of the Houthis. Taking out that group eliminates a key Al-Shabaab ally, weakening the Somalian militant organization in the process. The US essentially gets two victories for the price of one. That sets the stage for a critical question. What will the land assault against the Houthis look like? One thing that's certain is that the US won't be putting any of its own military boots on the ground. That would represent too high a risk, both in terms of losing soldiers and equipment in a Gulf state war and escalating the already high tensions between the US and Iran. Instead, the US will act as a facilitator, bringing together several factions within Yemen that oppose the Houthis to launch a ground assault with a single key goal: taking back Sanaa. The Yemen capital city has been under Houthi control for over a decade, which has allowed the Houthis to push out Yemen's elected government. Sanaa is vital to the Houthis. While it's not the militant group's main power base, that's the city of Sanaa, it's important because it provides the Houthis with a sense of legitimacy. Controlling Sanaa means the group can claim to lead Yemen, even though it technically doesn't. Holding Yemen's capital also makes it easier for the Houthis to control Yemen's major ports. Again, that's vital. Those ports are the Houthis' lifeline because it uses them to receive shipments of weapons and other goods from Iran. The Houthis' enemies understand this very well. Between September 2015 and January 2023, warships from multiple countries, including the US, Australia and Saudi Arabia, intercepted 16 ships sailing between Iran and Yemen. Those ships combined to carry 365 anti-tank guided missiles, 29,000 small arms, and around 2.38 million rounds of ammunition, all bound for the Houthis. Taking away Sanaa diminishes Houthi access to Yemen's ports. Not only does that stem the flow of weapons arriving into Houthi hands, but it will be a massive relief for Yemen's general population. Since the Houthis took control of much of Yemen, around 19.5 million of the country's 35 million people find themselves in dire need of humanitarian aid. That aid is controlled by the Houthis because they hold Sanaa and Yemen's largest ports. Breaking that hold would be as massive a humanitarian victory for the United States as it is a military victory over the Houthis and their Iranian backers. So, how will the US help to push the Houthis out of Sanaa? Bloomberg suggests that a multi-front assault is the most likely approach. Coordinated by the US military, such an assault could lead to Yemeni fighters on the ground pushing the Houthis out of the port city of Hodeidah, which covers the Iranian supply issue and takes away the port from which the Houthis launch most of their Red Sea attacks. With Hodeidah under their control, the ground forces could then push on to Sanaa. Those stationed in Hodeidah would push into Sanaa from the south, while other forces from the east applied pressure. But what forces? That's the key question, given that the US won't be sending any of its own soldiers into Yemen. The answers come from one man, Brigadier General Tariq Saleh. Saleh has an interesting role in Yemen's internal politics. He's the nephew of former Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who is partially responsible for the Houthis growing as powerful as they are. When the militant group took Sanaa, the former president briefly allied with them to maintain his position. That didn't last long, with President Ali later being killed by the Houthis during a power struggle. Since then, Tariq Saleh has served on the ousted Presidential Council of Yemen after having previously been the head of Yemen's Presidential Guard. In other words, he's been a key part of the Yemen conflict since it began, and he knows what it's like to be on the losing side of that conflict and to see his family torn apart by Houthi violence. Today, the Acled says that Saleh leads Yemen's National Resistance Force, or NRF. Also known as the Guards of the Republic, the NRF was established around 4 years after the Houthis took control of Sanaa and has the goal of freeing Yemen's north and west coast from Houthi occupation. It's a fairly strong force and it has close ties to the UAE, according to the Acled. Right now, the NRF has around 4,000 soldiers, with a further 5,000 training for battle at a UAE military base in Eritrea. The group operates primarily on Yemen's west coast, where it has engaged in skirmishes with the Houthis in the past. But there's a problem. Assuming all of the 5,000 NRF recruits currently training in the UAE join the upcoming land invasion, that gives the group around 9,000 combatants. The Houthis bring more than double that number to a fight, with the conversation claiming that the group's military arm has around 20,000 members. Does that mean Saleh will be fighting against a much stronger force in the US-aided land campaign? Not according to Bloomberg. It says that Saleh actually has access to around 50,000 fighters thanks to the support he has from the UAE. These fighters are likely from other paramilitary groups that have goals aligned with the NRF, at least in the immediate sense. These groups want to get rid of the Houthis too. However, they may also have their own ambitions when it comes to leading Yemen, as does Saleh. But that's a problem for the future. Right now, Saleh seems to be the man capable of uniting these disparate forces into a cohesive unit capable of taking on the Houthis. He also has a track record of working alongside international partners to limit Houthi influence. Saleh has cooperated with the US military in the past to provide intelligence on weapons shipments making their way to the Houthis from Iran. Some of this intelligence was likely used to complete at least some of the 16 ship interceptions we mentioned earlier. Saleh has also been working to build stronger ties with Saudi Arabia. That country led a previous attempt to oust the Houthis along with the UAE in 2015, and it has served as the venue for several of CENTCOM's recent talks about the Houthi problem. The Saudis will cooperate with Saleh because they want to stop the sporadic Houthi attacks on their vital oil installations. So think of Saleh as a figurehead, as he's already proven himself capable of uniting forces and working alongside countries that the US favors. If he truly has access to 50,000 fighters, which is more than double the 20,000 the Houthis bring to the fight, he seems like the perfect candidate to lead the Yemeni ground assault. There are just two problems the US has to overcome. First, it needs to deal with the scars left behind in Saudi Arabia and the UAE related to their combined failed attempt to oust the Houthis in the past. Saudi Arabia, in particular, may not want to get involved in a military campaign against the group again. Bloomberg points out that the country will worry about the possibility that it'll be forced to bear the brunt of the upcoming land operation, especially if Saleh's forces fail. However, Saudi Arabia may be swayed by the US and its most recent actions. Its current bombing campaign is far more intense than the year-long campaign the US launched against the Houthis alongside the UK in 2024. That earlier campaign focused on precision strikes against Houthi military installations, without necessarily targeting the group's leadership. The strikes taking place under current US President Donald Trump are far stronger and have many more targets. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz highlighted that during an interview with ABC a day after the US started its March airstrikes.
The difference is these were not kind of pinprick, back and forth, what ultimately proved to be feckless attacks. This was an overwhelming response that actually targeted multiple Houthi leaders and took them out.
Combine that with the US's recent military buildup in the Middle East, which has seen it transport a second aircraft carrier to the Red Sea and stash B-2 stealth bombers at a military base close to Iran, and the result is what appears to be a far stronger US response to the Houthi threat than any that's come before. Saudi Arabia and the UAE will pay attention to that and may be swayed into thinking that such heavy US involvement could prove useful to both of them. The Houthis being taken out in Yemen weakens Iranian influence in the Middle East. That creates a vacuum, particularly in Yemen itself, that both nations may attempt to fill. Of course, that power vacuum leads us to the second potential problem. What comes after the ground campaign? While the NRF under Saleh may be able to unite several of Yemen's factions to fight against the Houthis, problems will arise if that united force is successful. Each group pulled into the mix will have its own ideas on how to run Yemen. There's a possibility that eradicating the Houthis could lead to yet more internal conflict that, if left unchecked, could evolve into a full-blown civil war. Add Saudi Arabia and the UAE trying to ensure their interests are met in the aftermath of the land attack, and you potentially have a powder keg. Perhaps avoiding that situation is where the US will play its key role. To ensure the ongoing success of this land campaign, the US needs to prepare a force and account for what comes after. The first part of the plan seems to be close to completion. Saleh and his 50,000 fighters working in coordination with the US and its aerial forces ensure that. The US goal now is to make sure that everybody who's going to be involved in the liberation of Yemen from the Houthi scourge stays on the same page. Is that possible? Let us know what you think the answer to that question might be in the comments, along with telling us whether you think a coordinated land attack like the one we've described will be successful in Yemen. And please remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more updates on the evolving Gulf crisis. We're an independent source of news and information about military conflicts around the globe and strive to be as timely and accurate as possible. And we appreciate your support.